year was 1817, and England stood poised between old grandeur and quiet decay. The great estates still glittered beneath their chandeliers, yet behind the polished manners of society, the cold machinery of duty ruled every heart. Among the noble families that shaped this delicate world was that of the Duke of Wexmoor, a man spoken of in tones of respect, curiosity, and faint unease. His name was Edward Ashbourne, a figure of impeccable lineage and unyielding pride. His marriage, 7 years past, had been the talk of the season, an unexpected union between one of the highest peers of the realm and Lady Isabella Harcourt, a young woman of gentle birth but modest fortune. From the day their vows were spoken, the union was shadowed by silence. The Duke, a man governed by restraint and haunted by expectation, withdrew from the life that duty had pressed upon him. To the astonishment of his peers, he left his bride at Wexmoor Hall and returned alone to his London residence, where whispers of his solitude grew into scandal. He was never cruel in word, never public in neglect. He simply did not look upon her. Society, with its hunger for intrigue, filled the void with invention. Some said he despised her. Others claimed he was incapable of affection. Yet none knew the truth, that Edward Ashbourne feared what love might demand of him. At Wexmoor, Lady Isabella endured the weight of that silence with the poise of a woman raised to gentility, but not grandeur. She was 22 when she first became mistress of the hall, young enough to hope, yet wise enough to hide her hope from others. Her beauty was of a quiet kind, not the dazzling perfection of a portrait, but the living softness of sincerity. Her eyes held both patience and sorrow, and when she smiled rarely, it seemed almost a mercy. The servants, fiercely loyal, had long ceased to speak of the Duke in her presence. They guarded her dignity with unspoken tenderness, sensing that her greatest wish was simply not to be pitied. In those 7 years of absence, Isabella made Wexmoor her refuge and her responsibility. The gardens, once neglected, bloomed again under her care. The tenants found her door always open. The village church saw her kneeling every Sunday morning, her head bowed not in bitterness, but in resolve. She read aloud to the children of the groundskeeper, tended to the sick in winter, and walked the misted paths at dawn as though to remind herself that the world still breathed. She did not write to her husband. There was nothing she could say that silence had not already spoken. And yet she loved him. It was not the bright, reckless love of youth, but something quieter and infinitely more enduring, a devotion that existed not because it was returned, but because it was right. On the nights when rain lashed against the windows and the wind moaned through the chimneys, she would sit beside the fire and imagine what he might be doing in London. Was he reading by lamplight, attending the theater, or simply existing, as she did, behind walls of habit and pride? She told herself she did not wish to know. Still, her gaze would linger upon the door, as if half expecting footsteps that never came. In London, Edward's life was a study in controlled detachment. He fulfilled his duties in Parliament, attended the occasional dinner, and appeared to the world as a man perfectly content in his isolation. Yet beneath the polished civility, a restlessness stirred, a gnawing unease he could neither name nor dismiss. When letters from Wexmoor arrived, he would place them on his desk unopened for days. They were not from Isabella. She never wrote. They were estate matters, written by his steward, full of tidy reports and polite phrases. And still, he kept them all, as though some trace of her hand might have touched the paper. Among his acquaintances, the Duke was both admired and pitied. He has the fortune of a king, they said, but none to share it with. When pressed on his solitude, he would answer only, "My affairs are in order." It was the reply of a man who had learned to keep every emotion under lock and key. But on certain evenings, when music drifted from an open window or the scent of lilac reached him unexpectedly, memory pierced his composure. He would see her as she had been on their wedding day, standing before him in ivory silk, her eyes lowered, her lips trembling as she vowed herself to him without condition. That image, once buried, had begun to haunt him anew. Back at Wexmoor, winter arrived early. The first snow fell in November, covering the gardens she had so carefully tended. Isabella oversaw the servants as they hung wreaths of holly and evergreen along the great staircase. It was nearly Christmas, and though she had no promise of his return, she ordered the dining hall to be prepared as tradition required, silver polished, candles trimmed, firewood stacked high. When her lady's maid hesitated, Isabella said softly, "Hope costs nothing, Mary. Let the house be ready." Days passed. Each carriage that passed along the distant road sent a flutter through her heart, and each time the sound faded, she told herself she had not expected it to stop. On the evening before Christmas Eve, a letter arrived bearing the seal of the Duke. Her hands trembled as she broke it open. The message was brief, an apology penned by his secretary, informing her that His Grace would not return for the season due to pressing matters in London. The words were formal, untouched by sentiment, and yet she read them as though they were his own. When the servants learned the news, they quietly began to remove the garlands and cover the dining table. Isabella stopped them. "No," she said, her voice steady. "Leave it as it is." That night, she stood alone before the window, the snow falling softly beyond the glass, the empty hall behind her echoing with silence. She pressed her hand against the cold pane and whispered, "Then I shall love him enough for us both." Outside, the wind rose, scattering the last leaves across the frozen grounds, and just as the hour struck midnight, a distant rumble sounded through the stillness, the approach of wheels upon the frosted road. A carriage was coming, its lamps glowing faintly in the storm. The servant stirred, uncertain. Isabella turned toward the sound, her breath caught between disbelief and yearning. But when the door opened, it was not the Duke who stepped through the threshold. It was his solicitor, solemn and travel-worn, carrying a sealed packet in his gloved hands. He bowed low before her. "His Grace sends these papers, Your Grace," he said, his tone formal but uneasy. "He instructed that they be delivered into your keeping without delay." Isabella took the envelope, her fingers cold against the wax seal marked with her husband's crest. She dismissed the man with quiet gratitude, then stood before the fire, staring at the unopened letter. The flame flickered, reflected in her eyes, like two trembling stars. She did not open it. Instead, she placed it upon the mantel, folded her hands, and whispered to the empty room, "If there is sorrow in it, let it wait till morning." The fire crackled softly, and the great house fell still again. The world outside slept beneath the snow, while within, a single woman stood at the edge of her own endurance, neither broken nor bitter, but suspended in the quiet ache of hope unfulfilled. Spring returned to Wexmoor as though determined to remind its mistress that beauty could bloom even in neglect. The snow retreated from the gardens, revealing shy crocuses and the tender green of new grass. Lady Isabella walked among them in the soft light of dawn, her shawl gathered close, her breath mingling with the mist. The sealed letter still rested on her mantel, unopened. Some nights she thought to burn it, others, she imagined it contained words of apology, perhaps even affection. But each time her courage wavered. She told herself that uncertainty was kinder than disappointment. So it remained there, untouched, a symbol of the silence that bound her life. Her days were ordered and tranquil, each marked by quiet purpose. She oversaw the tenants' needs, visited cottages with baskets of food, and arranged lessons for the children of the estate. The villagers adored her. They called her our Duchess, though none had ever seen the man who had made her one. Her presence brought calm, her voice steadied the anxious, and her gentle command restored a dignity to Wexmoor that gossip had long denied it. Still, in the stillness of her own chambers, she felt the ache of incompletion, the faint sense that she lived not a life, but a rehearsal for one that had never begun. In London, the Duke's absence from Wexmoor had ceased to shock. 7 years of solitude had hardened society's curiosity into resignation. Edward Ashbourne continued to appear in political circles and charitable boards, his manner impeccable, his conversation dry. Those who observed him closely noted a fatigue in his eyes, a restlessness beneath his composure. Though his name carried weight, his gaze often drifted toward the window during gatherings, as though the glitter of chandeliers wearied him. He had everything a man might desire: title, wealth, respect, and yet each triumph seemed to press upon him like another stone upon his chest. One evening, while attending a small exhibition in Mayfair, Edward's controlled composure faltered. Among portraits of noble families and scenes of pastoral contentment hung a modest canvas, painted by a local artist known for capturing the uncelebrated corners of the countryside. The title read, Lady of Wexmoor. He stopped before it as though struck. The painting was simple. A woman seated by a window, her hands resting upon a book, her gaze turned toward the light. Yet something in that stillness, that tender restraint, cut through him. The painter had caught the essence of her solitude, the poise, the patience, the quiet suffering she bore without bitterness. It was her, Isabella. Every brushstroke seemed to accuse him gently of his neglect. For the first time, he felt not pride, but shame. Whispers rose among the attendees. "So that is the Duchess of Wexmoor," a lady murmured, her tone both pitying and admiring. "What a lovely creature, and how strange that her husband hides her away." Another replied, "Perhaps he fears she outshines him." Edward turned sharply and left the room before they could see his face. That night, he could not sleep. He stared at the city skyline from his window and remembered her voice, soft, hesitant, speaking vows he had barely heard. The memory felt newly alive, raw and unbearable. The next morning, he sent a note to the artist, purchasing the painting anonymously. Days later, when it arrived at his London residence, he placed it in his study and sat before it in silence. The expression on her painted face seemed to change with the light, serene by morning, sorrowful by dusk. Each evening, he found himself returning to it, speaking to it in half-formed thoughts he could never write down. And with each passing day, the distance between them grew intolerable. At Wexmoor, Isabella's world remained small but steadfast. A letter arrived from a London acquaintance, enclosing a clipping from a society column. It spoke of her portraits exhibition, of its melancholy grace, and of the renewed interest in the mysterious duchess whose husband refused to appear beside her. Isabella's heart tightened as she read. She had agreed to the painting only to raise funds for a local orphanage. She had never imagined it would find its way to London's gossip pages. Yet something within her stirred, an unease, and beneath it, the faintest flicker of vindication. For once, it was she who had been seen. The gossip spread quickly. The phantom duchess became a subject of fascination. Poets wrote verses in her honor. Caricatures of a sorrowful beauty trapped in a lonely castle appeared in pamphlets. Some suggested a secret lover hidden among the estate workers, others that the Duke was unfit for company. Isabella read none of it, but she sensed a change in how letters were addressed to her. Distant relations who had once forgotten her now wrote warmly, as if her sudden fame reflected their own refinement. She responded with grace, but her heart remained unchanged, gentle, measured, and uncertain of what such attention might cost. Late one evening, as she sat before the fire reading by candlelight, a parcel arrived. The butler, solemn and curious, presented it with no letter attached. Inside, carefully wrapped in silk, was a music box of intricate design, its golden casing engraved with roses twined around the Wexmoor crest. Isabella's breath caught. She remembered it. It had once belonged to the Duke's mother, displayed in his study at Wexmoor before his departure. She had admired it years ago on their wedding night, tracing the tiny enamel roses with a shy smile. And now it lay before her, gleaming softly in the firelight, its melody still pure. She turned the key, and the delicate notes filled the room, haunting, familiar, impossibly tender. For the first time in years, tears came freely. Was it a gesture of affection, an apology, or simply a relic of guilt? She could not tell. But as the tune faded into silence, something within her softened. "Thank you, Edward," she whispered, though no one heard. In London, Edward received word of her acknowledgment through his steward, who had reported her reaction with respectful discretion. The Duke said nothing, but that night, when his valet left him, he opened a small box from his desk, a folded handkerchief she had embroidered for him years ago with his initials. He ran his thumb along the stitching, realizing he had never once used it. He placed it beside the portrait and sat there until dawn. Weeks passed, and the scandal refused to die. The Ton speculated whether the Duke would at last return to his estate, some predicting reconciliation, others foretelling divorce. Edward, weary of the whispers and driven by an emotion he no longer tried to name, made his decision. He sent word to his steward, prepare Wexmoor Hall for his arrival. At the estate, news of his impending visit spread like wildfire. The servants exchanged glances, excitement mingled with fear. Isabella received the letter in the garden, where roses had just begun to bloom. Her heart pounded as she read the brief announcement. No apology, no explanation, only a date and time. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, unsure whether to tremble or rejoice. That evening, she sat once more by the fire, the unopened letter from winter still resting upon the mantel beside the now silent music box. For the first time, she lifted the letter and broke the seal. Inside was neither cruelty nor confession, only a formal note transferring certain estate decisions to her authority. A token of trust, perhaps. She folded it carefully, a strange calm settling over her. Outside, thunder rolled softly in the distance. The air carried the scent of rain and rose petals, mingling in the open window like memory and promise entwined. She looked toward the road that led to the great gates of Wexmoor and whispered, "Then let him come." And far away, on the road from London, a carriage bearing the crest of Wexmoor began its journey home. Rain fell in silver sheets as the Duke's carriage rolled through the wrought iron gates of Wexmoor Hall. The horses, weary from the journey, stamped against the gravel, their breath steaming in the chill evening air. From the windows of the great house, faint candlelight glowed, soft and steady, as though the walls themselves had been waiting. Inside, Isabella stood in the entrance hall, her hands clasped before her, every trace of fear concealed beneath perfect composure. She had thought of this moment 1,000 times, yet now that it had come, her heart beat with such force she could hardly breathe. When the doors opened and he stepped inside, the air itself seemed to shift. Edward Ashbourne, Duke of Wexmoor, had changed. The years had deepened him, the lines around his eyes carved by restraint rather than age. His coat was dark with rain, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, those gray, distant eyes, found hers and did not turn away. For the first time in 7 years, he looked upon his wife. "Your Grace," she said softly, the faintest tremor beneath her calm. He inclined his head, his voice low. "Lady Wexmoor." The words were formal, but something within them faltered. A silence followed, thick, fragile, intimate. Then, with the gentlest motion, Isabella turned to the butler and said, "See that his Grace's rooms are prepared." When she faced him again, her tone was composed. "You will wish to change before supper." He hesitated, as though uncertain whether to speak or obey, then bowed slightly. "As you wish." That first meal together passed beneath a veil of politeness. The long dining table stretched between them like a chasm. Rain beat against the tall windows, the sound mingling with the delicate clatter of silver. Isabella ate little, Edward less. Their conversation was courteous but hollow, remarks about the estate, the weather, the tenants. Yet beneath each phrase, meaning trembled unsaid. After supper, he lingered by the fire in the drawing-room while she poured tea. The firelight played across her face, catching the gold in her hair, and he found himself studying the delicate movements of her hands. How strange, he thought, that something so familiar could feel utterly new. "You have managed the estate well," he said at last. "Better than I had any right to expect." Her eyes lifted to his, calm but searching. "I managed what was left to me, my lord. Duty leaves little room for despair." He flinched slightly at her choice of words. "It was never my intention that you should live in despair." "Intentions," she said quietly, "often differ from consequences." The clock on the mantel struck the hour, its echo filling the silence that followed. Edward turned away, his jaw tightening. "You believe me a coward." "I believe," she answered, "that you are a man who fears his own heart." He looked at her then, really looked, and for a moment his composure faltered. "You speak boldly for one so wronged." "I speak plainly," she replied, setting down her cup. "After 7 years, plainness seems the only courtesy left between us." Something flickered in his gaze, a blend of admiration and shame. He moved closer to the fire, his voice lower now, stripped of authority. You do not understand, Isabella. I thought. He stopped, searching for words. When we married, I believed I could give you everything except affection. I thought it better to withdraw than to offer something hollow. Her breath caught. And did you imagine neglect would feel less hollow? He closed his eyes briefly, as if the question wounded him. I thought distance would preserve you from my failures. I see now it preserved nothing at all. She rose then, slowly, every motion measured. You speak as though I were a thing to be preserved, my lord, not a woman to be loved. He turned sharply, and for the first time there was heat in his voice. Do you think I did not want to love you? The sudden force of his words hung between them, startling in its sincerity. She stared at him, the firelight flickering between them like a living thing. Then why did you not? His answer came almost as a whisper. Because I did not believe I could. The admission disarmed her. For a heartbeat, she saw not the proud Duke, but a man hollowed by uncertainty. She stepped closer, her voice gentler now. And what do you believe now? He met her gaze, and something within him broke, quietly, irreversibly. That I have been blind, he said, and that in my blindness I lost what little grace was ever mine. They stood in silence, the rain softening to a hush outside. The fire crackled, filling the space between words. Isabella's composure wavered. Her hands trembled against her gown. For 7 years, she had dreamed of his remorse, yet now that it was here, she felt no triumph, only a weary tenderness. Edward, she whispered, for the first time using his name. I asked for so little, only that you see me. His eyes glistened in the firelight. I see you now. But the moment's fragile peace did not last. The following morning, a servant arrived with a London paper, its gossip columns alive with speculation. Beneath a crude sketch of Wexmoor Hall ran the headline, "The Reconciliation of the Phantom Duke," or "The Duchess's Triumph." Edward's face hardened as he read the words aloud. They think this homecoming, is a show. Society will speak as it pleases, Isabella replied quietly. But they mock you. They mock us. She regarded him steadily. I endured their mockery long before you returned. It is of no consequence to me now. Her calm only deepened his torment. You endured it because of me, he said bitterly, because I lacked the courage to defend you. And yet, she answered, her voice soft but unwavering, you stand here now. Is that not courage enough to begin? The words stilled him. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with visible effort, he folded the paper and cast it into the fire. The flames consumed it slowly, ink curling to ash. He looked to her, eyes dark with something between pain and gratitude. You are stronger than I deserved. She smiled faintly. Strength is often born of necessity, not choice. That evening, as dusk fell across the moors, Isabella felt her strength falter. A fever had been rising in her since morning, subtle at first, then burning through her limbs with unrelenting heat. By nightfall, she could scarcely stand. When the maid rushed to summon help, Edward was already at her side. He lifted her gently to the bed, his composure gone. Isabella, forgive me, he murmured, pressing a damp cloth to her forehead. I should never have left you alone. Not then, not ever. Her lips moved, barely audible. I am not angry, Edward, only tired. Do not speak of rest, he whispered fiercely. You will live. You must live. Through the haze of fever, she looked at him with faint astonishment, as if seeing him for the first time. You care. His hand trembled against hers. More than I know how to bear. Her eyes fluttered shut, a fragile smile tracing her lips. Then it seems, she breathed, we have both been blind. He stayed with her through the night, the fire dying low as dawn crept across the room. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean. Yet within, the Duke of Wexmoor knelt beside his sleeping wife, her frail hand clasped in his, and whispered to the silence, If she lives, I will never look away again. The night was drenched in storm. Rain lashed against the windows of Wexmoor Manor, the heavens seeming to echo the turmoil within. Edward paced before the dying fire, his reflection in the glass distorted by lightning's glare. For 7 years, he had avoided her presence, buried himself in Parliament, estates, and duty, anything to drown the ache that stirred when he thought of her. Yet tonight, the sound of her soft voice in the hallway earlier, frail, barely audible, had undone him entirely. The physician's words haunted him. The duchess's strength wanes. She must not be left unattended. He could no longer remain still. The corridors, once cold and silent, felt alive with his guilt. As he ascended the staircase toward her chambers, each step carried the weight of unspoken years. The door stood half open, the faint glow of candlelight spilling across the floor. She sat by the window, her figure fragile against the backdrop of storm clouds. A shawl was drawn tightly over her shoulders, her gaze distant, fixed on the dark more beyond. "Isabella," he spoke, his voice a low tremor. It was the first time he had uttered her name since their wedding night. She turned, startled not by his presence, but by the tenderness in his tone. "Your Grace," she said, her voice composed, though her hands trembled upon her lap. "You should not trouble yourself. I am quite accustomed to solitude." He took a hesitant step forward. "Do not call me that," he murmured. "Not tonight. I have been a coward long enough." Her eyes, once soft and uncertain, met his with quiet strength. "And what courage have you now found, my lord?" He faltered, unable to look away. "The kind born from fear, fear of losing what I was too blind to see I loved." He moved closer, the distance between them shrinking like years, collapsing into a single breath. "I thought avoidance would spare us both. I told myself you were a stranger, a duty. Yet in every silence of this house, you lingered. I could not enter a room without sensing your grace in it." She smiled faintly, a fragile thing tinged with sorrow. "Words are kind, my lord, but they come late. I am not the woman I was 7 years ago." "Then let me meet her," he said softly. "Let me know you as I should have then." The wind howled beyond the glass, rattling the panes as though the world itself held its breath. Isabella turned her gaze back toward the storm. "When I first came here, I believed love was something that could be earned through patience. I thought if I served, if I smiled, if I obeyed, I might become worthy of your regard. But years of silence taught me otherwise. Love cannot be begged into existence. It must be given." He sank to one knee before her, the proud Duke of Wexmoor stripped of his titles, of his armor. "Then allow me to give it freely, if not for your forgiveness, then for my own redemption." Her breath caught. "You speak of redemption, Edward, but what of trust? What of the years that hollowed us into strangers?" "I cannot erase them," he said, his voice breaking, "but I can live the rest of my life, trying to fill what they emptied. If I have one truth left to offer you, it is this: I cannot live without you." The words hung between them, trembling in the air like fragile glass. For a moment, she said nothing. The candles flickered, the storm outside began to wane, its fury softening into rain. At last she rose, her hand light upon his shoulder. "Then rise," she whispered, "for I will not have my husband kneel before me, not as a penitent, but as a man who finally dares to love." He stood, uncertain, as she looked into his eyes, their distance measured not by years, but by forgiveness itself. "You have every reason to despise me," he said quietly. "Perhaps," she replied, "but I am too tired to hate, and too human not to hope." He reached for her hand, pressing it gently to his lips. The gesture was reverent, almost hesitant, as though afraid the touch might vanish like a dream. She did not withdraw. Instead, her fingers tightened around his. "Stay with me," he pleaded, "not as duty, not as pity, but as my wife in truth." A single tear slipped down her cheek, though her smile was steady. "If you mean your words, then let this house be witness to our beginning, not our end." He exhaled, the tension of years dissolving into quiet relief. "Then tomorrow the garden shall bloom again," he said softly. "I will see it restored for you." She shook her head gently. "Not for me, Edward. For us." The fire crackled, warm against the hush that followed. Outside, dawn's first light broke through the clouds, washing the moors in pale gold. In that light, the manor no longer seemed haunted, but alive, reborn, like the fragile hearts within it. He drew her close, his hand resting at the small of her back, not in claim but in reverence. She leaned against him, her eyes closing as if surrendering to peace long denied. For the first time since their vows, they stood together, not as strangers bound by title, but as two souls who had finally learned the cost and the grace of love. And as the storm passed into memory, the Duke of Wexmoor pressed his forehead to his wife's and whispered, "No crown, no estate, no legacy could match what I have found tonight." Her reply was barely a breath. "Then let this be our true beginning." The candles dimmed with the morning light, their shadows fading upon the walls. Within that fragile dawn, love, wounded, weathered, yet unbroken, took its first breath anew.